The history of the drug trade in New York City is deeply intertwined with the evolution of gangs and organized crime groups. From the mid-20th century through the early 2000s, New York's role as a national and international hub of commerce and immigration made it a prime location for the trafficking, distribution, and consumption of illicit drugs. Over these decades, the city's criminal underworld evolved significantly, shifting from traditional mafia hierarchies to decentralized street gangs. This transformation was driven by changes in drug markets, law enforcement tactics, and socioeconomic conditions. This video explores the shifting roles of gangs and organized crime groups in New York's drug war, focusing on their origins, operations, intergroup rivalries, and the governmental responses that shaped the city's drug landscape across 6 decades. In the 1940s and 1950s, the dominant organized crime force in New York was the Italian-American mafia, composed of the 5 families: Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Bonanno, and Colombo. These groups exerted significant control over various illegal enterprises, including gambling, extortion, labor unions, and narcotics. While narcotics were not initially a major focus for the mafia, due in part to the belief that it would attract unwanted law enforcement attention, some factions engaged in the heroin trade. The infamous French Connection heroin trafficking network, which brought heroin from Turkey through France to the U.S., operated with mafia involvement. The Genovese and Lucchese families were notably implicated in this scheme. The drugs would arrive in New York, where they were distributed through tightly knit networks. Despite the mafia's formal policies against drug trafficking, enforcement of such rules was lax when profits were involved. The heroin trade began to expand, primarily in Harlem and other impoverished neighborhoods, laying the foundation for street-level distribution by African American and Latino gangs in later decades. By the 1960s, the drug trade had become increasingly decentralized. While mafia families still handled large-scale importation and distribution, street-level operations were increasingly taken over by smaller gangs, often rooted in the city's marginalized communities. During this period, heroin addiction reached epidemic levels, particularly in Harlem, the South Bronx, and Bedford-Stuyvesant. The Harlem heroin economy was notable for its hierarchy. Local kingpins, often independent of the mafia, managed their own distribution empires. Figures such as Frank Lucas and Nicky Barnes emerged as powerful players in the Harlem drug scene. Barnes formed the Council, a 7-man African-American drug syndicate that controlled much of Harlem's heroin market in the 1970s. Lucas, meanwhile, established direct connections with Southeast Asian suppliers, cutting out the mafia middlemen. At the same time, Latino gangs such as the Young Lords, which began as a political group, and Puerto Rican street crews became involved in the street-level drug trade. The economic vacuum left by white flight and industrial decline created an environment where drug dealing became one of the few viable sources of income. Law enforcement response was slow and often marred by corruption and racial bias. During the 1970s, the NYPD and federal agencies began to more aggressively target drug traffickers. Operations such as the 1975 takedown of Nicky Barnes marked the beginning of a shift toward heavy-handed federal drug enforcement. The 1980s witnessed a seismic shift in New York's drug underworld with the emergence of crack cocaine. Cheaper and more addictive than powdered cocaine, crack flooded the city's neighborhoods and dramatically increased both addiction rates and violence. The economics of crack changed the structure of drug dealing. Instead of centralized kingpins, crack markets were often fragmented and operated by loosely organized gangs or crews. This era saw the rise of numerous street gangs such as the Supreme Team in Queens, the Lowlifes in Brooklyn, and Sex Money Murder in the Bronx. Many of these gangs were loosely affiliated with national organizations like the Bloods and Crips, or with prison-based groups like the Netas and Latin Kings. These groups were territorial and often engaged in violent turf wars. The Supreme Team, led by Kenneth Supreme McGriff, became one of the most infamous gangs of the era. Operating out of the Baisley Park houses in South Jamaica, Queens, the group built a massive crack empire. McGriff modeled his organization on corporate structures, with enforcers, lookouts, and street dealers operating in a hierarchical system. Violence spiked during this period. New York's homicide rate soared, and the city was dubbed the murder capital of the U.S. in the early 1990s. Gangs used violence not only to protect territory, but also to discipline members and instill fear in rivals and the community. Law enforcement response intensified. Under the Reagan administration's war on drugs, mandatory minimum sentences and aggressive policing tactics led to mass incarceration. The NYPD launched units like the Street Narcotics Enforcement Unit, and federal authorities conducted large-scale investigations, such as the FBI's Operation Pressure Point in the Lower East Side. However, these efforts disproportionately affected minority communities and often failed to dismantle the larger networks. By the 1990s, crack use had begun to decline, but its impact on urban communities and gang culture remained profound. As older kingpins were imprisoned or killed, younger, more volatile gangs took their place. The Bloods and Crips, which had originated in Los Angeles, began to spread throughout New York's prison system in the early 1990s and spilled into the streets by the mid-90s. The United Blood Nation, UBN, a federation of blood sets formed in Rikers Island, quickly grew into a major force in New York's gang landscape. The Latin Kings, originally formed in Chicago, also expanded in New York during this period. These gangs maintained strong prison street connections and were involved in drug trafficking, extortion, and violent crime. Meanwhile, Dominican groups like Dominicans Don't Play and other loosely organized Trinitarios began asserting control over sections of Washington Heights and the Bronx. These gangs often operated as both street crews and family-based organizations, utilizing connections in the Dominican Republic to access cocaine supplies. At the same time, New York began to see the results of broken windows policing and zero-tolerance strategies promoted by Mayor Rudy Giuliani and NYPD Commissioner William Bratton. While the city's crime rate began to decline, critics argued that the crackdown on petty offenses and aggressive surveillance disproportionately targeted Black and Latino communities. Despite increased arrests and incarceration, gangs adapted quickly. Many diversified their operations, moving into other illicit markets such as credit card fraud, gun running, and human trafficking. Others decentralized, making them harder to track and dismantle. By the 2000s, the nature of organized crime and gang activity in New York had changed significantly. While the Italian mafia still existed, albeit weakened by decades of RICO prosecutions, their dominance in the drug trade had waned. Street gangs, particularly those with ties to national and international networks, now controlled much of the drug distribution in the city. One of the most notable shifts was the emergence of transnational criminal organizations. Colombian and Mexican cartels, including the Sinaloa and Gulf cartels, began to play a more direct role in supplying drugs to New York. They often used Dominican intermediaries to distribute cocaine and heroin through local gangs. The heroin market experienced a resurgence in the 2000s, with purer forms of the drug becoming widely available. This resurgence set the stage for the opioid crisis that would explode in the 2010s. In response to the increasingly complex drug trade, law enforcement embraced intelligence-led policing. Joint federal-local task forces, such as the DEA's New York Drug Enforcement Task Force and the NYPD's Gang Squad, focused on dismantling criminal networks through long-term investigations, wiretaps, and informant-driven prosecutions. Technology also changed the game. Gangs began using encrypted messaging and social media to coordinate operations and recruit members. The NYPD, in turn, developed sophisticated cybercrime and surveillance units. While these tools increased arrests, they also raised civil liberties concerns. From the 1940s through the early 2000s, the drug war in New York City transformed radically. What began as a mafia-dominated heroin trade evolved into a decentralized, globalized drug economy driven by a mix of violent street gangs, prison-based organizations, and transnational cartels. Each wave of change reflected broader economic, social, and political shifts, including urban decline, mass incarceration, immigration, and globalization. Gangs and organized crime groups adapted at each stage, often exploiting new markets and technologies faster than law enforcement could react. Though crackdowns and policy reforms occasionally disrupted operations, the underlying conditions, poverty, marginalization, and systemic inequality, allowed the drug trade to persist and evolve. Understanding the historical role of these groups in New York's drug war offers essential insight into the nature of urban crime, the unintended consequences of drug policy, and the need for holistic approaches that address root causes rather than symptoms. Now let's look at the role of corrupt NYPD officers in the New York drug war. From the 1940s through the early 2000s, the New York Police Department was both a central actor in fighting drug crime and, paradoxically, a source of corruption that fueled the very drug trade it sought to eliminate. Corrupt officers within the NYPD undermined drug enforcement by engaging in drug trafficking, taking bribes from dealers, leaking information, planting evidence, and even committing violent acts on behalf of criminal organizations. These corrupt actions not only compromised law enforcement integrity, but also intensified the violence, inequality, and systemic distrust that characterized New York's decades-long war on drugs. This explores how police corruption evolved across 6 decades, how it influenced the drug economy, and how systemic failures enabled it. It will also analyze the most notorious corruption scandals, the structural causes of misconduct, and the public and institutional responses to restore accountability. In the 1940s and 1950s, the illegal drug trade in New York was largely controlled by organized crime syndicates, particularly the Italian mafia. The NYPD during this time was deeply influenced by political patronage and lacked centralized oversight, creating opportunities for collusion between officers and mob figures. Many officers were bribed to ignore heroin trafficking operations run by mafia families like the Genovese and Lucchese. Corruption often involved beat cops and narcotics detectives turning a blind eye in exchange for monthly payments or favors. Officers would sometimes tip off traffickers about impending raids or investigations, allowing drug operations to continue undisturbed. Although not as widely publicized as later scandals, the culture of protection and silence within the department meant that corruption was rarely punished. Internal affairs units were ineffective, and the blue wall of silence, an unwritten code discouraging officers from reporting misconduct, was already firmly in place. By the 1960s, heroin addiction had reached epidemic levels in neighborhoods like Harlem and the South Bronx. While public pressure mounted for a stronger police response, many narcotics officers saw this as an opportunity for personal enrichment. The French Connection scandal of the late 1960s and early 1970s is emblematic of this era. The operation involved smuggling heroin from Turkey through France into New York. After heroin was seized, corrupt NYPD officers stole large amounts from the evidence room. Between 1969 and 1972, over 400 pounds of heroin, worth tens of millions of dollars, disappeared from NYPD custody. Several officers were implicated in a conspiracy to resell the drugs on the streets, fueling the very crisis they were supposed to fight. This period culminated in the Knapp Commission, formed in 1970 by Mayor John Lindsay after revelations from whistleblower Frank Serpico. Serpico, an NYPD detective, exposed widespread corruption in the department, particularly in the narcotics and vice squads. The Commission's 1972 report detailed 2 types of corrupt officers: grass eaters, those who passively accepted bribes and gifts, and meat eaters, those who aggressively sought out criminal collusion for profit. The commission found that drug dealers routinely paid off officers for protection and that entire precincts were operating under a system of corruption. One officer testified that drug traffickers would put Christmas money in every man's envelope, and any cop who refused to participate risked being ostracized or worse. Despite these findings, reform efforts were uneven, and corruption remained entrenched in certain units. The 1980s crack cocaine epidemic transformed New York's drug markets into highly lucrative, violent, and competitive arenas. As crack flooded neighborhoods, so too did opportunities for corrupt police officers to profit. Some of the most notorious cases of NYPD corruption occurred in this decade. Officers in narcotic squads engaged in theft from dealers and evidence rooms, selling drugs themselves, extorting drug dealers for protection money, and falsifying reports to cover misconduct or inflate arrest stats. A key figure in exposing this culture was Michael Dowd, a Brooklyn patrol officer who, between 1986 and 1992, led one of the most infamous corruption rings in NYPD history. Dowd and his partners sold drugs, protected cocaine shipments for Dominican drug lords in East New York, and even kidnapped and tortured rival dealers. Dowd's case was not an isolated incident. In Queens, officers were caught stealing money and drugs from crime scenes. In the Bronx, internal investigations revealed entire squads regularly accepted bribes and manipulated evidence. The Mullen Commission, created in 1992, concluded that the 1980s were characterized by a new breed of corruption, officers who were not just turning a blind eye, but actively participating in the drug trade. The Commission found that internal affairs had failed to investigate many credible reports of misconduct, and that supervision was almost non-existent in high-crime precincts. Corrupt officers often worked in poor minority communities where accountability mechanisms were weakest and public complaints were less likely to be taken seriously. By the early 1990s, the level of police misconduct reached a crisis point. Public trust in the NYPD was at an all-time low, especially in Black and Latino neighborhoods where residents routinely accused officers of brutality, corruption, and collusion with criminals. In response, Mayor David Dinkins established the Mullen Commission in 1992, led by former Judge Milton Mullen. The commission conducted a sweeping investigation into police corruption, particularly in the context of the drug war. Its findings were devastating. Officers were pocketing thousands of dollars a week from drug dealers. Some precincts operated with institutionalized corruption networks. Internal Affairs Bureau was reactive, not proactive, and often failed to follow up on serious complaints. And corruption was most common in narcotics and anti-crime units where oversight was weakest. The Commission noted that officers like Michael Dowd were able to act with impunity because of a culture of silence and inadequate supervision. It also emphasized that corruption had evolved. It was no longer about taking bribes to look the other way. It now involved direct participation in the drug trade, robbery, and violence. As a result, the NYPD launched new reforms, a bolstered IAB, early warning systems to flag problem officers, and the creation of a full-time commissioner of internal investigations. But even as these measures were implemented, critics argued that the reforms were cosmetic and that true accountability remained elusive. By the 2000s, the nature of the drug trade in New York was changing. The crack epidemic was waning, but heroin and prescription opioids were rising. Gangs were becoming more decentralized, and international cartels were playing a larger role. Amid these changes, police corruption persisted, albeit in subtler forms. Some officers engaged in traditional misconduct, planting drugs, falsifying warrants, or stealing from suspects. Others participated in more systemic abuses, such as manipulating crime statistics to make precincts appear safer or using stop and frisk as a tool of racial profiling and social control. A key case was that of Officer Jose Tejada, who worked in Upper Manhattan and was convicted in 2008 of leaking information from federal databases to Dominican drug dealers in exchange for cash. He warned traffickers about raids and surveillance efforts, undermining months of work by federal and local agents. Another scandal involved officers in Brooklyn South who were caught planting drugs on innocent people to boost arrest quotas. These collars for dollars were driven not by direct payment from dealers, but by departmental pressures to increase drug arrests regardless of legality. These cases showed that corruption had become more diversified, motivated not only by greed, but also by institutional pressures, racial dynamics, and the erosion of accountability. Police corruption in the drug war had far-reaching consequences. It empowered criminal networks. When officers sold drugs or protected traffickers, they gave criminal organizations the confidence and security to expand operations. It distorted justice system. False arrests, planted evidence, and coerced testimony led to wrongful convictions, especially among poor and minority suspects. It eroded public trust. In communities most affected by drugs and crime, residents often viewed the police not as protectors, but as predators. This mistrust made cooperation with law enforcement difficult, weakening efforts to fight crime and diverted resources. Corruption diverted attention and resources from serious investigations to covering up misconduct or pursuing arrest quotas. From the 1940s to the early 2000s, corruption within the NYPD was a significant and often overlooked component of New York's drug war. While many officers served honorably, the actions of corrupt individuals, enabled by weak oversight, institutional racism, and perverse incentives, deeply compromised public safety and justice. Each major corruption scandal revealed systemic failures and prompted reform, yet corruption proved resilient, adapting to new environments and incentives. While commissions like Knapp and Mullen uncovered the depth of the problem, meaningful accountability was often short-lived. The story of police corruption in the drug war is not just about bad cops. It is about institutional cultures, broken systems, and the complex interplay between crime and law enforcement in a city shaped by inequality, race, and power. Understanding this history is essential not only for evaluating past failures, but also for shaping a more just and transparent system moving forward.